Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress. As many of you may know, I do have a full-time job, and I've actually been on vacation from my full-time job for a few weeks now. But before my summer vacation ends and I head back to work next week, I wanted to take some time to share a project with you guys that I've been working on in bits and pieces all summer long. Today I'm going to show you how I made a set of floating nightstands for our new apartment with a live edge drawer front. These are literally perfect for our space because we have a bed with storage underneath, so now we can still access the storage under our bed while having storage next to our bed. I am so excited about the way these things turned out, and I cannot wait to show you how I made them, so let's get started. I get asked a lot where I source my lumber for projects, and for this project I actually decided to use a combination of lumber that I ordered online as well as got locally, and also had some lumber stored in the ceiling of my workshop, so I use that as well. And I am pretty much obsessed with working with walnut. I think it is gorgeous, so that is pretty much what I use for the bulk of this build minus the drawer, but we'll get there when we get there. So while the pieces of walnut that I had were gorgeous, they definitely needed some love. So to get started, I measured all of the pieces I needed for my project and cut them a little longer than I needed to start with, just to make them more manageable for the milling and cleaning process. But as always, you can find the full measurements for this project as well as a step-by-step on my website by clicking on the link that I left below this video in the video description. Now, once I had cut all of my pieces down to their tentative sizes, I then ran them through my planer a couple of times to get them nice and flat and cleaned up, and this made a huge difference. I then brought everything over to my table saw and began to square up the edges on the table saw, and this just basically gives a really nice clean surface for me to use when I glue up the pieces into panels in a little bit. So basically, in order for these floating nightstands to function as floating nightstands that I could use practically, I needed to glue together panels to create the tops, the bottoms, and the sides of the floating nightstand. Obviously, in an ideal world, it would have been awesome to have just one solid wide panel to use for this, but gluing these together worked perfectly, and as you see, I don't have a jointer in my workshop, and I was totally able to make this work just using my table saw. And for friends with questions about clamps, this next segment is for you. Okay, so I get this question a lot, and I want to talk about it while I am staring at all of these clamps. So I get asked a ton if you have to have these really long bar clamps that I use in a lot of my projects to do panel glue ups, and the answer is no. I actually just experimented on this project with using some other clamps as well, and it seemed to work out pretty okay. So I'm gonna unclamp some of these and show you what I use. So for instance, on these panels I use these quick clamps, and basically I just clamp them on the side. I lined up the side of the panel with the actual bar on the clamp, and then after making sure that everything was nice and flat, I then put them on top of these little paint pyramids just to kind of get them off of the surface so they don't get glued down or stuck to the surface when I take the clamps apart. Now on this panel, for instance, I actually use just regular old wood clamps. The best advice I think I could give when using the regular clamps is just make sure your clamps are long enough. But check this out. So here are the regular clamps, and as you can see, I kind of just prop them up like that and then just left them on the table to dry like this. So yeah, I think as long as you are making sure that everything is super straight and not cupping or twisting while it is drying, then you can pretty much use whatever clamps that you have on hand in your workshop. For me, I do like to use the bar clamps. I think it helps to keep everything super straight, but totally an option. Obviously not necessary unless you need like giant clamps to do giant glue ups. But yeah, I'm happy, and I think that we should get all of these panels out of the clamps and move on to the next step. What do you think? Sounds good. So basically, after leaving these panels overnight to dry, I then removed all of them from the clamps, and even though I removed the bulk of the wood glue from the panels before glue up, I did just want to make sure they were perfectly smooth, so I did run the panels through my planer just one more time after the glue up. Now, if you don't have a planer, this is a step that can definitely use a belt sander or some sort of aggressive sanding grit, but for me, the planer was just super quick and efficient, so that's why I used it. At this point, I then trimmed down all of my panels to their absolute final dimensions just to make sure that all the ends were perfectly squared, and then I brought them over to my table saw to start cutting my mitered edges. There were two different directions I could have gone in with the edges for this floating nightstand project. I either could have cut the edges at 90 degrees and then joined them that way and just made these really simple butt joints, or I could have made my life a little more difficult and done some really cool 45-degree mitered edges, and of course that is what I chose for this project, but I'm so happy that I did that. Now, I opted to use my table saw for this step, but I have done mitered edges in the past, like for my waterfall storage bench, where I have used a circular saw with a track. So if you don't have a table saw and you want to see how to do lots of parts of this project with a circular saw, definitely head on over to that video and check it out. Now, once I was done cutting all of my pieces for each individual box, I then began to lay them out, and then I used some painter's tape to just prep the edges for the glue up. So back in the day on my channel, one of my first projects was this like retro upholstered looking bench, and I actually used the same exact method for that bench, and that bench is still holding up beautifully and looks awesome. So I decided to do the same thing here, where I taped the edges, practiced the glue up, and then once I was happy with the alignment, I then added glue and began to just glue this box together to create the carcass for my nightstand. Honestly, the beauty of doing it this way is that you're kind of able to see what everything is going to look like before you start to glue things up. And for me, glue ups are super stressful. So being able to lay everything out before I added the glue was just so helpful for peace of mind. And once I was able to get everything aligned using the tape and the glue, I then carried the box over to my clamps in like a different clamping station, because I did have to clamp two of these up at once, and then made sure to add as many clamps as I could while making sure that all of the seams and miter joints remained totally aligned and square. But honestly, who are we kidding? I was still so nervous to do the second glue up for the second nightstand, even though the first one went really well. No less nervous to do the second one. But luckily, after a successful glue up on both of the nightstands, I then left them overnight to dry and then came back the next day and removed all of the clamps to prep this build for its next phase. So because this build was kind of like an unplanned therapeutic build, I didn't really make actual legitimate plans for this, and so this part was kind of an afterthought and I was mad at myself about it, but it worked out anyway. Essentially, I had to make a back panel for both of these floating nightstands because I'm going to be hanging them on the wall using a French cleat system, and the French cleats needed somewhere to sit and be installed into. So basically, to do this, I cut 2 pieces of wood, one back panel for each nightstand, and I basically cut them to the measurements I needed to fill the space in the back of each one of the stands. I then installed some pocket holes through the back of these in order to drill them into the nightstands, because that was just kind of the best way to get them in there and flush and to make sure that they were strong enough to hold up the cleats. There are a couple ways that you can hang a floating nightstand on the wall. You can drill them directly into the wall through the back panel. You can hang them using D-hooks. You can hang them using a French cleat system. I actually ended up opting for a French cleat system for this project so that I could make sure that they were perfectly level without drilling directly through the nightstand. But in order to do that, I did have to inset this back panel because I wanted the French cleat system to be inset enough to where there wouldn't be a huge gap between the wall and the nightstand when I hang it up. And you'll definitely see this a little better later when I install the nightstand, but ultimately it seemed to work out pretty well, and just running a dry fit was definitely the best bet before making sure everything was permanently attached. So once that back panel was installed, then the bulk of the nightstand build was complete, and all that was left to focus on was creating the drawers. And to begin, I actually went out and purchased 2 of these planks of poplar and glued them together to create the bottom of the drawer boxes. Again, though, if you're looking for dimensions for this and the type of lumber that I use, definitely check out my website. I have all of the details listed there so that you can make your own if you're interested. Now, while those drawer bottoms were drying, I then moved on to creating the drawer box, which I also made out of poplar that I purchased at my local home improvement store. To get started, I marked and measured all of the pieces that I needed for each one of the drawer boxes, so that was 8 pieces in total, and then I cut those pieces out using my miter saw before beginning the assembly process. Now for the assembly process, I simply just attached these drawer boxes together using some screws and some wood glue, but I decided pretty quickly that I didn't like the idea of seeing the screw heads through the drawers when you opened up the drawer boxes. I wanted them to look super clean, so I actually pre-drilled some larger openings before inserting those screws with the wood glue, and I then filled those openings with dowels and wood glue after the fact, and it just made it look like I attached the drawers using dowel joinery instead of using screws. Now, once those drawer boxes were assembled, it was time to then start working on the bottom of the drawers, and this was when I took those panels out of the clamps and then began to cut them down into 2 separate bottoms for the 2 separate drawers. Luckily, my miter saw was able to accommodate all of the cuts that I wanted to make on these drawer bottoms, but if yours doesn't, then you can definitely use a circular saw or a table saw for this process. But once they were both cut to size, I then inserted them inside of the drawer boxes and then attached them to the inside of the drawer boxes from the outside using a brad nailer. Once those drawer boxes were assembled, the last part of this build process was to focus on the drawer fronts, and I got these absolutely gorgeous live edge walnut slabs online from Jeff Mack's Supply. I've linked them below in case you want to check them out, but basically I saw these online, I knew I wanted them. They were actually originally marketed as boards for charcuterie boards, but I saw them and knew that I wanted to make drawer fronts out of them immediately. So I'm so happy that I had them on hand for this project. I used my track saw to cut them down to size. I basically decided to square up a couple of different edges here, but still keep some of the live edge intact as kind of like a decorative feature, but also practically as a place to put your hand so you can open the drawer. And once I cut out those drawer fronts, it was then time to install them inside of the drawer box. And I used this little card trick that my buddy Fix This Build That uses in his projects, where I just put an equal number of cards on each side of the drawer to make sure that it's perfectly spaced. And once I was happy with that spacing, I then tacked it into place using a pin nailer, which is perfect because you can barely see these holes from the pin nailer. I then pulled the entire drawer box out and then permanently attached that front frame of the drawer front to the box using some screws that I countersunk into the drawer box. So I wanted as much drawer space as possible in these nightstands, which meant that I had to build the drawers to basically the exact same dimensions as the inside of this nightstand, with the exception of the front of the drawer, which was inset about 3/4 of an inch to accommodate that front panel. So to stop the drawers from tipping forward when you open them, instead of using metal drawer slides, I actually installed some makeshift wooden drawer slides using some leftover walnut. And this is actually a really simple workaround for tight drawers that I learned from John Peters on YouTube, and I've linked his tutorial below my video in the video description, so definitely go check it out because he does a much better job of showing you this process and explaining this process. Obviously, at this point, the lighting in my shop was not ideal for a tutorial, so please go check his video out. It's so helpful. But once those drawer slides were installed, it was then time to move on to the finishing process, and I started by filling all of the knots and holes in the nightstands using some tinted wood putty. I then sanded all of the nightstands down to about 220 grit, and then I decided to actually wax the inside of the nightstand so that the drawers would move so much easier, and I also waxed the drawer boxes as well. As for the rest of the nightstand, I actually opted for a different furniture finish that was a penetrating finish, and I applied it, I wiped it on, I allowed it to sit for a while, and then I actually applied a buffing pad to my orbital sander and then buffed out whatever finish did not absorb into the nightstands just to give it a really beautiful, sleek, and gorgeous look. I then allowed these nightstands to sit and dry and cure overnight, and then the next day I came back and the first thing I did was install the first half of the French cleat system, which is this awesome system that I actually got from Hangman Products. It's so easy to install. I just applied the bracket directly to the back of these nightstands using self-tapping screws. And then I brought all of the hardware as well as those nightstands to my apartment, where I marked the studs on the wall next to the bed, measured where I wanted everything to go, and then used the other half of the French cleat system with a built-in level to make sure that everything was level. I then screwed that into the wall using self-tapping screws as well, and then just placed that nightstand onto the bracket. Literally so easy. Turning my therapeutic hobby of woodworking into a business has been the most amazing journey, but it's not always that I get to just make a project for me without a looming deadline or a plan. So it was so nice to be able to finally just kind of like create something on my own timeline and in my own way for our new apartment. I am just so stoked about how these nightstands turned out. They could not have turned out any better in my personal opinion. I love the creative storage. I love that they're floating because we can still access the storage under our bed. I love those live edge drawer fronts. This definitely is one of my newest favorite projects. I know I say that about all of my projects, but really there is just something so special about these nightstands, and I am so excited about them. I really hope that you guys like this project as much as I do. If so, please make sure to subscribe to my channel if you are not subscribed yet. There will be way more projects coming at you in the very near future. But until then, friends, I'm so excited that you are here. Thank you so much for watching my video and for all of the support. And until next time, friends, happy DIYing.